Hey friends, it's Melvin. Thanks for tuning into this episode. Here's just a few quick things I wanted to notify you guys about before we get started. First up, very soon, new episodes will be releasing Wednesday mornings rather than Tuesday. So don't panic if you don't see a new episode on Tuesday. Just wait a little longer and you'll see it in your feed. Second, we've introduced a mailbag. Check those show notes and toward the bottom you'll see a mailbag link. You'll then be able to text us any questions you might have about movies, the movie industry, or any movie/Christian related questions you might have. Then we'll respond in a future episode, so send us your questions now. Up next, Patreon polls, which are available to Patreon supporters at the $3 tier or higher, have been updated. Supporters can now suggest films or shows to be reviewed at the end of each month. The two most liked submissions will become the options for the Patreon poll, so if you want to hear us talk about your favorite movie or show, join our Patreon and start campaigning. And lastly, whether you're a new or longtime listener, please consider writing a review or rating the Cinematic Doctrine podcast on iTunes and Spotify. Apart from financially supporting on Patreon, these are the two most helpful ways to support the show. And that's it. Enjoy the episode.
Hi, my name's Melvin, and I'm not throwing away my shot. Welcome to Cinematic Doctrine, a Christian podcast service that encourages and equips Christians to engage and reform the culture of cinema. In this episode, I'm joined by Chris Staron of the Truce podcast, and we're here to talk about Thomas Kail's Hamilton. This movie was chosen by the lovely patrons who support Cinematic Doctrine with a small monthly donation. For as little as $3, you too can have the opportunity to vote for a movie we discuss at the end of each month by heading over to Cinematic Doctrine's Patreon. A link will be available in the show notes. Chris Staron is the creator of Truce, the award-winning Christian podcast that looks at history to deep dive into the Christian church. You're going to hear so much more about him and his work when we finally get through this introduction, and all of it is such good stuff. But my goodness, after hearing his podcast, I just had to have him on the show. In fact, the latest episodes of Truce, as of this recording, have been on the Founding Fathers and other important aspects of American history. So it only made sense to have him join me for this episode on Hamilton. For starters, Chris shares his absolute love for Hamilton, and how he's been a huge fan since it toured. We also dig into its questions on legacy, pride, and the unique benefit of having a story that spans many years. Then we run headfirst into some fascinating trivia I collected for this episode, which sparks some great conversations on cut content and cultural impact. Afterward, Chris shares some historical inaccuracies that give insight into the way Lin-Manuel Miranda refined the flow of the play. And finally, I asked Chris what he thinks about the criticism helmed against Hamilton for its, somewhat ironically titled, whitewashing of the Found Fathers. But you know how we do. Let's give y'all a quick synopsis on Hamilton, some content awareness, and get that call to action out of the way before we get into the episode. Hamilton, the award-winning musical, chronicles the heroic and tragic history of Alexander Hamilton, a founding father and the first Secretary of the Treasury for the United States of America. From orphaned child to one of the most powerful people in the colonies, Alexander Hamilton repeatedly finds himself at what will soon be considered key points in U.S. history, and he's not throwing away his shot. In breaking new ground, Hamilton features a diverse cast, performing typically white roles, with music that varies across popular modern genres such as hip-hop, R&B, jazz, and a little bit of British invasion. It's a hopeful look at history from the lens of the 2010s, and one that's found new life in its recent digital release via Disney+. Hamilton is rated PG-13 for language and some suggestive material. Disney has censored all of the uses of the F-word that are in the original play, but you can still figure out where they're placed at times because, well, a couple of the songs, it's just really obvious that they were there and can be a little distracting since some characters are just yelling into the air but you don't hear them. So it's distracting but also kind of funny at the same time. But basically there's language throughout the play, across a variety of words that may be offensive to some. Also, there's some slanderous speech that's targeted at other characters. The suggestive material is likely regarding a song that details a solicitous act between characters. The lyrics are suggestive, but in all honesty are nowhere near as graphic as some of the written depictions of salaciousness in the Old Testament. In other words, if you're currently reading through the Old Testament like I am, the lyrics won't be very bothersome because you've just recently read some crazy stuff. However, during a dance, there is a little bit of what I guess I'll describe as touchy-feely. Although it's neither aggressive nor is it disrespectful to the boundaries between performers or really audience viewers. That said, it still happens. And there's a couple other songs that have suggestive lyrics. Also, it totally makes sense that the certificate doesn't mention this, but the musical does take place during colonial America, so there's some war violence that's depicted on stage. Now, before we head into our Hamilton discussion, I wanted to share real quick that if you've come to enjoy Cinematic Doctrine, consider leaving a review for the podcast on your respective podcast app at the end of this episode. Unlike YouTube or Reddit, there isn't really a way to let us know how we're doing with a thumbs up or thumbs down, so the best way is to leave your thoughts on the podcast by writing a review on iTunes, Podchaser, or wherever you listen. Apart from that, Cinematic Doctrine also has a Patreon. For those who don't know, Patreon is a website for independent content creators to raise support for their work. By creating an account on Patreon, you can select a content creator you like and support them with a monthly donation. If you enjoy Cinematic Doctrine and would like to support the show, consider donating, as it helps cover the cost of producing the podcast. And as a bonus, if you support Cinematic Doctrine for as little as $3 a month, you're opted into a once-a-month movie poll where you decide a movie we discuss in the podcast. You also gain access to the SynDoc Pre-Show, a Patreon-exclusive podcast series where my co-host Daniel and I casually talk movies, Christianity, and life itself. There are other unique benefits that come with supporting the podcast, so be sure to check them out at patreon.com/cinematic doctrine. And be sure to check out Chris Staron's podcast Truce, the award-winning Christian podcast that looks at history to deep dive into the Christian church. Using interviews with experts, music, games, and recipes, Truce uncovers the things that glom onto the Christian church so that we can protect our witness to the world. It's all about how we got here and how we can do better. Without further ado, here's our thoughts on Hamilton. Chris Staron of the Truce podcast. What's going on, man? Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I am excited about this topic and for the chance to be on the show.
I'm incredibly excited too because I went into Hamilton completely blind, both, well, somewhat historically, but like music, everything about it. I just knew that it was popular years ago and now is on Disney Plus. That's all I knew.
You hadn't seen it or heard the soundtrack?
No, nothing. I know the soundtrack's been out forever, but like this was my first time getting through it.
Oh my goodness, what a treat to go back to those early days of hearing it for the first time. I'm such a super fan. Maybe I shouldn't say that early on, but I'm a big fan of the show, of Hamilton. And it's always a surprise to me when people don't know it. So it's like, I want to tell you all these things. And I guess that's what we're going to talk about today.
I love it. I love that we're basically now having someone who is well-versed in Hamilton and then me who knows nothing and can now learn everything. I love it.
Oh, you've done a bunch of research. Yeah, I think you know a lot now.
I'd hope it's good.
Yeah.
Instead of like a poser, like someone who's just like, yeah, I skateboard, but then only just wears skateboard clothes.
Sure.
But like, but yeah, before we get started, tell us about like what you do, your podcast, all that jazz.
Right. Yes. So my name is Chris. I am the host of the Truce podcast. And the show is trying to look inside the Christian church at the things that have glommed onto Christianity, like pyramid schemes, political campaigns, big business. How did Christianity get tied to capitalism? And we have a lot of fun doing it, get interesting guests, and I invent games and interesting ways to discuss things, all in an effort to preserve the Christian witness and see how these things impact our witness to the world. So that's the main project I'm working on now. I used to make Christian films, Bringing Up Bobby in Between the Walls, and I wrote a novel, Cradle Robber, which is a Christian time travel novel.
Now I'm way more interested in your novel. I know you had said it, and I was like, well, I definitely don't have time to read that before we get together.
Right.
But,
yeah.
But now I'm like, that sounds awesome. Why? Can you tell us a little more about that?
I was really interested in sort of that anger that we Christians can get into, that we would often write it off as righteous anger, but as you're helping out with people more and more, especially if you're working with poor people or people with mental disabilities, you can get really frustrated and really angry, and you just want to change the world and force it to look like you want it to be. So it's a story of a man who invents a time machine basically so he can go back and try to force the world to act like he wants it to be. And of course, he ends up becoming what he doesn't like. And so it's an interesting book. You don't see a lot of anti-heroes in Christian novels, but I went for it. And it does have a touch of romance in it as well, for those who like romance. But ultimately, that book is kind of sort of a perfect precursor to my show. And it's like talking about a specific issue. And in the case of the book, it's abortion, and our anger over that issue and how that ultimately impairs our witness if we let that anger control us, instead of trying to love on people the way Christ would love on them. So it's go for it. You can find it on any ebook platform, and it's only $4 right now.
I'm gonna have to read that because I absolutely love that, and I think like even you mentioning just the really interesting reality of there not being many anti-hero narratives in Christian literature,
Right.
but then like you go and read the Old Testament and pretty much
goodness.
everybody's a quote unquote anti-hero at some point. We had recently talked about Samson, the Pureflix film, but mostly just talked about the biblical story because that's where the wealth of content is. And like, that's an anti-hero story.
Right. Absolutely.
He is still in the book of Hebrews as a faithful servant to God. And you're like, but I just read his story. How? But that's what's so cool about it. So that's awesome. What a challenge, but what a good challenge. I'm sure that was a very rewarding book to write.
You know, it was difficult because the Christian fiction market is mostly aimed at women. So I actually had an agent talk to me and said, I won't pick you up unless you write under a woman's name. Because the market is so focused on women that it doesn't know what to do with men. And so a book that was about a man who was struggling with anger didn't really fit into the traditional publishing mold, because it's very much about romance and Amish romance right now, and has been for quite a while, actually. And if you don't fit that mold, they don't know what to do with you. So it can be a struggle to try to push boundaries and make new things. I mean, here we are, we're talking about Hamilton today, about who would have thought that a musical about the first Secretary of the Treasury in the United States would be a worldwide phenomenon and done in hip hop. I mean, who would think? But, now it seems like a totally obvious thing. But a few years ago, everybody would have thought you were crazy to be like, oh, I love this musical about the Treasury Secretary. Somebody has to break those boundaries. And the Christian publishing world is really afraid of that. But who knows? Someday, maybe they'll innovate.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I was just thinking like a brief thought right now that like you had just kind of introduced yourself and gone into things and mentioned that you did 2 movies, but then I'm over here like, book? Let's talk about your book on
Isn't this a movie podcast?
Oops, sorry.
Oops, yeah.
while we're talking about a musical on our movie podcast even. Yeah. So it's like we're breaking the rules. We're in theme. We're breaking the rules.
Yeah, it's all creative stuff. Yeah, my twin brother and I made 2 feature-length Christian films. Very low budget because we didn't have much money, and right at the tail end of DVDs. So when it was really, really hard to make money back, it's even worse now. But so you can actually, speaking of Pureflix, you can see our film Bringing Up Bobby on Pureflix right now. It's part of that subscription. So go watch it and leave us a good comment.
There you go.
Be nice. We didn't have a lot of money. No, I was going to say we were also trying to push boundaries there with having a lead character in a Christian film who was a goth kid, and who was very likable and funny and smart.
Oh, I love that.
And a little awkward. So, and it's a comedy, which some people don't think belongs in the Christian sphere. But I feel like is just a fantastic way. Comedy has this ability to convey very deep truths that you can't do in a drama without feeling heavy-handed. But in a comedy, you can get away with a lot more stuff, and really you can get very deep in a comedy. So
absolutely. We briefly mentioned, I think, in a Syndoc pre-show, so Patreon supporters, you probably have heard this already. But in the Syndoc pre-show, we were talking about different preaching styles, and one of them was like some preachers don't think comedy should be at the pulpit. But then it's like if you're reading through Esther, which is a really challenging book,
yes,
but it's also kind of a dark satire, and it has a lot of dark comedy to it. And so, it's amazing how scripture has all of these things in it that we right now would say would break the mold for Christian literature or Christian storytelling. And then like if you go and read the Bible, you're like, man, they broke these rules years ago.
Of course.
Like
Yeah. Like you said, like
they're already doing it.
anti-heroes. There's a lot of murder in the Bible. There's incest. There's,
Yeah. It's crazy.
It really is a fascinating book. If you haven't read the Bible for yourself, I mean, it's the bestseller of all time. I don't need to tell you to read the Bible, but read the Bible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is amazingly accurate and important to everything that we do in our life. Wouldn't you agree,
Really
Chris?
is. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Even to the point of like our Christian market right now is so focused on positivity. And that if you believe in God, life is going to be easy for you. And if you read the Bible, there is nobody in the Bible who had an easy life.
Yeah. I'm going through Isaiah. I call them age-led because that's how I would remember the order when I would do a Bible test. But
Okay.
Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations,
yeah.
Ezekiel, Daniel. And like, it's just nonstop misery. And
It
just
is.
keeps going. But there's this constant hope running through it despite the misery. And I think channeling that is so much in tune with the Christian life.
So much.
Because this is a deeply hopeless, feels hopeless world, especially right now as we're recording.
Yeah.
We don't need to repeat why the time currently is, because probably the last several episodes of our podcast we've mentioned it at least once. But the irony of how hopeless it can feel is that in Christ there is so much immense hope. And so I think if you're losing that aspect of I don't know what the term is. I guess you could say ambivalence, this happy sad that is the Christian life right now.
Yeah.
Then like you really don't get to experience all of it. But man, now I'm like, we need to have another podcast where you and I can just talk. Like
we're
at
gonna have
length
our own
about-
show.
Yeah,
Oh my goodness. Did I
there's
just like
just so
nudge
much.
out your co-host? What is going on?
Sorry, Dan.
Sorry,
Bye.
Dan. Oops.
Oh man. But before we end up running a spin-off podcast,
Of course.
we really need to get into Hamilton because there's so
Yes.
much
Oh
good
my goodness.
stuff here.
Yes.
So much good stuff. So let's start with you, Chris. Why do you love Hamilton? And I'm guessing you rewatched it recently or have rewatched
Yes.
it several times since it was put on D+.
Yes.
What are you feeling about Hamilton?
I've seen it. I saw the traveling show in Salt Lake City, like on stage, and then I saw the Disney Plus version, and I've seen it 1.5 times now. And I know the music backwards and forwards. And I think what I love about Hamilton, there's so many things I love about it. Obviously, there's so much great singing in it. I love the lighting. I used to make films, and my brother and I were very cinematographically conscious about everything we did. And you see just such deliberate care in the way that they coordinated the dancing and the lighting together. It's just such a marvel. One of the great tools of cinema is that you can often use the camera to tell people this is where you can look. But on Broadway or on stage, there's no camera. You've got that whole big space that you have to be like, okay, we got to look in this back right corner, And so through the lighting and through the direction of the actors and the choreography, they draw your eye just like a camera lens over and over and over again. To me, it's just a beautiful thing to behold. Of course, the music is fun, and there's a lot of really good messages in there about keeping your head up and working hard and don't get into duels.
Yes. Definitely.
Which, it seemed like Hamilton just could not get. But it really is an interesting mix of different things that you would not think would work, and pushed a lot of boundaries. Like even hip hop in musicals, it would be like, I think you're going to get into this later, but you think about like back in the 80s when the rock musical began,
Right.
And it was kind of an innovation. Like a lot of the Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals, like Jesus Christ Superstar or something, it's got an electric guitar in it. Who would think that would work? It was an innovation, and we're kind of seeing that switching over in musicals now, which I think is really exciting because some of the musicals that came out in the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s, was like they're all the same. So I think Hamilton came
Right.
in this really great time where it could just mix things up a little bit. So anyway, that's I'm going to stop there. That's good enough for a soapbox.
Yeah, I think the messages and themes are really great at kind
Yeah.
of painting the death of works righteousness,
Yeah.
because so much of Hamilton's character and this is talking strictly about the play, because I really don't know how historically accurate it is. I have some vague understandings, but at least
Yeah.
as the play itself, it really paints the deceptively dangerous belief that you are constantly having to best yourself and
Yeah.
others too, because like Hamilton is constantly putting himself in a position where he's not giving away his shot. Basically,
Right.
he's not going to miss the opportunity to do something more or better, or to build up his legacy, because the whole thing is very much like that. I really loved that. I think it's a great tragedy. I think it's a great
Yes.
American tragedy, like the history of America, and thinking of even thinking of kind of Americana rhetoric, where it's this. I mean, America has a very works righteousness ideal. I mean,
Yeah.
the American dream is about building yourself up and all that stuff. In fact, this is even more why I'm so glad you're on, kind of in the midst of what you're covering with Truce Podcast, because you're covering America's sins, and then you're
Yeah.
also covering how America has been kind of intertwined with Christianity, and how
Yeah.
Christians have to deal with that in
Right.
some ways. Thinking about this story as sort of a historically American tragedy of the dangers of works righteousness, and then ultimately this big call of like, who's going to tell your story.
Right.
Like, yeah, and we're going to definitely dig into this one way further in the episode, but how people are interpreting his story, because
Mhm.
some people are saying like, this is true evidence of the failures of the American system, and you can predict the ultimate failure of the American experiment based on the founding fathers and their failures. And then the other side is the who's going to tell your story and the positive legacy that extends from it. It's all very fascinating to me. And
Yeah.
what I loved about the play is that as it's developing, you're beginning to see more and more about their history, and about like it has one of the qualities that I think is paramount to great narratives in literature, and that's basically, instead of spanning your story across a day or a couple days, it spans across a couple years.
Right.
and
Yeah.
so you start with Hamilton as he's kind of a nobody getting somewhere, to he's got several kids, plenty of sins in his closet, plenty of legacy things and characters and figures that he's been with. I mean, that's why the rivalry between him and Aaron Burr is so powerful in the play, is because you've seen that rivalry from the start.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that Aaron Burr is not a typical bad guy. Like, you don't see him like, contemplating bringing down evil into the world or something. He's just a guy who's jealous in the show.
Right.
And we've
Right.
all been jealous. We've all seen somebody succeed when, we feel like we should have been succeeding. So you get that relatability in there as well. That, we all kind of want to be the Hamilton, but many of us find ourselves as the Burr.
One of the funniest reviews that I actually had perused about this. So I use a website called Letterboxd to log all my movies, and I really enjoy reading thoughts from the community. And one of them was just a funny little quip that was, it's funny to have Aaron Burr be the main character, and yet the play is called Hamilton. Because
Yeah.
so much of the emotional weight is built by the character of Aaron Burr.
Yeah.
And how they're both the same people, just very different. It's like two
Yeah.
sides of a coin, where like, yeah, there's heads and tails, but mostly we just talk about what's on the heads of the coin,
Yeah.
even though there's a tails.
You kind of see that. There are other times in Broadway history where you see that, like Evita. The narrator is Che Guevara, who opposed Evita, Eva Perón, and he is the one who is narrating the whole show. He's the backbone of the show, in the same way that Aaron Burr is the backbone of Hamilton. So that,
Right.
Yeah, there's sort of I guess there's precedent for that kind of thing, but it does make it interesting to know, because I think most of us know that Aaron Burr ends up shooting Hamilton at the end. It adds that really interesting kind of tension of like, why is this guy singing about him? When they're supposed to be enemies, and sometimes
Right.
even praising him. Yeah.
And part of that, who's going to tell your legacy, is on the back of the individual. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
last thing he sings, I think, in that one particular song, is that like now he has to carry that weight.
Right.
And that's part of people's legacy, is having to carry the sins you've committed to other people.
It's true.
And,
Yeah.
and that's a rippling effect, because that extends outward. I mean, would Eliza go on to building of an orphanage if Hamilton was around? And that's part of the legacy of Hamilton, but that's also part of the legacy connected to Aaron Burr affecting Hamilton in a very fatal fashion.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we don't know, most of us don't know Aaron Burr from anything but having shot Hamilton. We don't know about his accomplishments. We don't know about his attempts to take over Mexico.
Right.
It's kind of a fascinating character, senator, but we don't pay attention to that stuff. My whole background before I saw Hamilton was that Got Milk commercial. I don't know if you remember that one. Did you remember that commercial?
I have been using no ad stuff for like a decade and a half, so I have no memory of commercials.
This was like 20 years ago, and it was great. It's a really famous commercial, and it does tie back into the musical, I promise. But there's a guy who's he's in a museum, and he's eating like a peanut butter sandwich, and on the radio they say, to win the big prize, you call in and tell us, or we're going to call you and you tell us who shot Alexander Hamilton. His phone rings, he picks it up, and they're like, what's the answer? And he says, Aaron Burr, because he's got, peanut butter sandwich in his mouth, and he can't get it out. And so he ends up losing this contest because he doesn't have any milk to wash it down with. And so like the Hamilton cast actually reenacted that commercial.
Oh my goodness.
Which is just fantastic. And in the commercial, like the original commercial, he's like in a museum surrounded by stuff of the event, like the dueling pistols and all that kind of stuff. And he's like uniquely positioned to be able to answer that question. And that's another reason I really love Hamilton, is that you can see all of this stuff that they did for the community. Because even though they were huge and people were paying like $1,000 for the tickets, they knew that there were people who could not, pay $1,000 for a show. That is a significant portion of my income. People like me can't pay that. But they would do these Ham for Hamilton shows out in front of the Broadway theater, where they would perform songs and skits and stuff. And then they had a raffle that if you won, you would pay $10 per ticket for a front row seat to Hamilton. And my brother actually won one of those in Chicago, not for the original cast, but got to see Hamilton for $10 from the front row. So I think that's another thing I really love about them as a cast, is they were willing to give back to their audience, because they knew some of us are poor.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it kind of goes in theme with the accessibility of Hamilton too, because that's sort of what blocks me from wanting to dig into the world of theater plays and musicals. I have a friend who is pretty invested in it, and I've gone to his local shows, several of them actually, and I've enjoyed all of them. Because as somebody who watches as many movies as I do, there is a point when I've just given up. I have really given into suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
And that's kind of theater. Like theater is like Hamilton is, this bullet is traveling in slow motion.
Right.
How do you know? Because an actor's standing there with their fingers holding a quote unquote bullet, carrying it across. And to me, knowing that this format is that way, I'm easily able to suspend disbelief, and I'm like, this is really powerful. And this is great. This is blowing my mind. But because it's in a theater that is typically smaller and it has to accommodate for the sound traveling to the back seats and all that jazz, it's not going to get as much travel as some sort of movie showing in 1,000 theater screens across the United States.
Exactly.
And so like the cost of getting into that the cost of getting into that particular medium is very difficult. And so that's wonderful to hear, because it does sound like for them too. I mean, they were just doing it because they love it and they want to do it as much as they can. I mean, I think I read 8 shows a week. I'm like,
Unbelievable.
that's crazy. That is
Yeah.
exerting a lot of energy. You're singing while you're moving. You're singing very loudly, so your throat, I mean, you're just probably drinking lemon tea constantly.
All day. Yeah.
It's just like,
Yeah.
it's insane. I loved the play. I loved the music, and I loved the story and the creation behind all of it in that way. And I think that's what may also can make for really great art, is the surrounding content of the art,
Oh,
because
yeah.
that puts into perspective the legitimacy of the project itself, because it really is about like the atmosphere of the play with the music and the way the story is told, and in certain ways I would say the off the cuff lyrics
Right.
creates a very modern accessibility to it, no matter how much Disney Plus wants to censor the play.
Right.
And yeah, so it's great. I think, having known nothing about it and now knowing 2 weeks worth of solid information about it, I am completely convinced in why this was such a big deal. And
Right.
I think that's so cool. I think it's so cool.
Yeah. And obviously, there are a lot of reasons people object to it, but I think that as a
Yes.
work of art, you kind of have to step back and be like, yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yes, absolutely. As a work of art, as a cultural phenomena, I think all of that definitely gives value to it. I've brought it up before on the podcast and I'll bring it up again, and it's going to sound like out of left field. But having read A Clockwork Orange and agreeing with Anthony Burgess that it is a uh, totally needless story, recognizing its cultural impact is important to understanding it. That doesn't mean it's good.
Right.
But knowing that it had a massive cultural impact, or at the very least in the art scene, a cultural impact, that's important.
Right.
Hamilton is significantly more, I would say, more valuable than A Clockwork Orange.
Oh, yeah.
But it has the same vibe where you really have to recognize it now because of the platform it's been given.
Yeah.
And that's fine, because it's good.
Yeah.
That's
And it's a
fine.
great tool to enter some really big discussions about, racism.
Yes.
Can we kind of reappropriate things in history in art? Can we cast, a very diverse cast of people in roles that were, white guys, basically? Can we do those things? And what is the cultural impact? It asks a lot of really big and important questions. And I think that's a sign of a great piece of art, is that it asks some really good questions and kind of leads you to a place where you can discuss it.
Absolutely. And I'd love to talk further about that. But
Yeah.
I think some really interesting stuff might be some trivia about
Oh,
Hamilton that absolutely some of which blew my mind, and
yeah.
others that I found very, very funny. So would you want to go through those, Chris?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. So the first thing that I ended up finding out, just and several of these are from a couple different interviews and stuff, which unfortunately I don't directly cite. I just put at the bottom of this document, and I'm not going to scroll down. So
Yeah.
just know that these are out in the ether, totally accessible. The first one that I found fascinating was that Lin-Manuel Miranda began writing a song for Ben Franklin, a character who doesn't even show up
No.
in this, but I believe it was supposed to be around the time that Lafayette, right before he comes back and is introduced in the beginning of the second act, he was going to have a song with Ben Franklin. His idea was to give him a country rock song, as he felt Ben Franklin was a totally different generation, which that immediately to me goes, okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
And to use Miranda's own words, he wanted it to sound like the Decemberists, as he's a big fan of theirs. However, he ultimately cut it because he felt like jumping across the ocean, like again, after doing it for King George several times. He just felt that would have been too much and kind of pulled away from that. Also, from what he's learned, Hamilton and Franklin never really intersected beyond the Constitutional Convention,
Yeah.
but he already comfortably kind of intersects characters that we're pretty sure didn't actually meet historically. So I think he could have made an excuse for it. But I think also, I think jumping across the ocean for anybody else other than King George would have been a little disorienting, to say
Yeah.
the least.
But you probably noticed that for King George himself also has a different style of music. He has sort of a
Exactly.
British invasion style song with that poppy da 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 da
That's
da
right.
da 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 da.
And it's also the only one that sounds a bit more like a classic musical,
Mhm.
which I think for me evoked sort of, here's the old and it's King George, and here's the new and it's
Mhm.
hip hop music and much more stuff like that. So I think what's great about this play, the more I read about it, is that there's so much that Lin-Manuel puts into it that there's a lot of ways to interpret stuff. So
Right.
I think King George is one of the best places for interpreting
Oh,
stuff
of
because he is
course.
such a great character.
Yeah, and he's barely on screen, but he totally just steals the show.
Yeah, it's amazing. So the second one I found was that another cut idea was a rap battle about slavery between Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison. That alone, the description can seem a little challenging, and it was in the midst of an interview that he described it that way, so I can understand just very passively saying it that way with perhaps a little less care, but I'm sure that he's not meaning it in a very bad way. Anyways, to contextualize that, Miranda intended that the play would include a fair balance of good things in some of these figures and bad things, which if you've seen the play, you know that there's a fair amount of bad that these characters do that make you question their morality a fair amount. The first half very much grounds the setting, and then the second half of the play really digs into like, man, these guys really are just politicians.
Right.
They're all
Yeah.
just a bunch of scumbags. And
Well,
so not to,
I would say they're fallible, but I mean, which is an
yes.
interesting thing because, like, one of the criticisms of the show is that it sort of has this hero worship of these fallible characters. But if you look at it, I mean, all of them have flaws that they have. I mean, Hamilton sleeping around on his wife.
No, not only sleeping around on his wife, but then defending his honor by just saying, I didn't break the law. I just slept with somebody. That's not better.
Right. I
Like,
think, yeah, it's something. It's not, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, and that's a real
total
thing.
worship of his position.
Right. Yeah. And that's, something that really happened. But it does show you that he's not perfect.
Exactly.
And he was obviously a workaholic. He didn't know how to say no to a duel, which is like a very fundamental principle to staying alive, especially when you've witnessed so many duels in your life. Yeah.
Chris, do you think you could stand down a duel, or do you think you'd have to go through with it?
Oh, I could never go with it. I could never go through with it at all.
Not even to defend your honor?
I don't have honor. Are you kidding me? I drive a school bus to pay for a podcast. I don't think I have a whole lot to fight for.
Boast in Christ.
Yeah,
Brother,
I don't have very far to
Christ.
fall, so it's not a big deal.
Go.
Yeah.
But yeah, continuing with that, Manuel said that he wanted to have this fair balance of good things and bad things too, and one of them would have been this particular song. So basically, the song would have had Jefferson emphasizing how he's written against slavery, while Hamilton argues the absurdity of that, knowing that Jefferson is currently having an affair with one of his slaves, and then Madison would clap back by calling out Hamilton's own affair. And the song would kind of keep going back and forth, and it would be like, these guys are thinking about slavery, but they don't do anything about it. Why? Because they're all weak and cowardly. And in the end, Miranda ends up cutting the song because he felt narratively and historically the culmination of the conversation didn't really go anywhere.
Right.
And so, which yeah, historically it didn't. They talked about it, but then nothing happened because slavery kind of kept happening, and then systematic issues kept happening up until now. So
right.
He's then felt that, like, as much as that is an indictment against the founding fathers and would have been a very effective and probably very poignant thing for Hamilton to have, it would effectively full stop a particular plot point of the play and really damage the pacing. And this is where I was reminded of, I don't know if you know of the movie The Room by Tommy Wiseau.
I have not seen it. I've heard a fair bit about it, but yeah, it's supposed to be one of the worst movies of all time. Yeah.
Yes, and it has a lot of very entertaining things about it. I'm not necessarily recommending here because it does have a particular aspect of the play or of the movie that's not good. But there's a particular plot point that comes out of nowhere when when one of the characters is talking to her mother and her mother just out of the blue with no preparation just goes, and the test results came back. I definitely have breast cancer. And then the conversation just goes back to whatever else it was talking about, never brought up again,
Huh.
anything. Now, it would not be as drastic, let alone as somewhat comedic as that to have this song in the play, but I completely understand how it's like, why bring something up that's really not a focus in this particular interpretation of these historical events
Hmm.
and then just not bring it up again.
Yeah.
Not only would I feel like that's irreverent to that particular conversation, it also just wouldn't do it any service, which I know is part of the criticism that Hamilton is getting.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because one of the other rap battles does feature Hamilton and Jefferson going back and forth about paying for labor and slavery.
That's right.
And so it's a really interesting mix whenever you try to get into those discussions, because people want you to focus so much on that and spend.
Right.
It's sort of like in a Christian film where you have to spend some unspoken percentage of it talking specifically about Jesus. And if you don't hit that percentage right on, everybody freaks out.
And then if you do hit that percentage rate on, you better be coming at it from the position of the particular denomination that's watching it.
Right. Oh, it's impossible. But it's the same with slavery. I mean, obviously a very important issue, but there are so many issues involved in the show. And also trying to carry a storyline. It's a tough balance that Lin-Manuel Miranda had to walk in order to address all that. I mean, there is a rap battle in this thing about creating the national debt, which is like, who else does that?
Right.
But I mean,
Right.
a huge part of Hamilton's legacy was creating the national debt in order to bring together the states, to take states' debts and assume it in the federal government. After the Revolutionary War, to try to bring some unity to them. And it's like, how come nobody is saying, oh, there's not enough talk about the national debt in the show? But the thing is, like, slavery is very much addressed in the show. It's just not lingered on probably as much as that magic percent that people would like. And also, we don't. One of the main criticisms of the show that's going on right now is that several of the heroes of the show, the protagonists, were slave owners, like George Washington, and possibly Hamilton himself may have owned slaves, and so that there's some conflict in that, and they don't really address Washington's slavery, except for the actor who played him. At the very end, the last song, Who Lives, Who Tells Your Story. I can't remember the exact name of it. At one point, Eliza mentions slavery, and he looks ashamed. The actor kind of interpreted that, that once he got to heaven, basically he would realize that his sin was slavery. It should have been addressed. Yeah. But it's basically in the show, it's basically just him putting his head down.
Sure.
So it's not much. But that's one of the main criticisms that's going on right now, is that it doesn't, it sort of sets up these protagonists who were also part of that sin of slavery. Well, it's tough for us because we as audience goers are so used to sort of, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy. And in reality, in a lot of history, you'll when you find out the whole story, you realize that things are a lot more complex than just the good guy and just the bad guy.
We're living in a period where maybe your generation experienced a bit of it, and my generation is absolutely experiencing it, and I have no idea how Zoomers are doing, but I'm sure it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Where a lot of the things that you've been raised on, you're learning all these horrible things about certain things. I have an episode that I did last year on Amazon Prime's The Boys, a show that I probably would have never recorded or talked about now, but then I just had different sensibilities. However, I still defend how I spoke about it in the episode, because the show is a cynical take on superheroes, and how if there were superheroes and they had all this immense power, they really still just be frat boys and they'd be jerks about it and they'd be terrible. And it's like, there's a lot of irony to that and a lot of comedy to it, but it's like also really challenging material.
Yeah.
And I was like, why are people so fascinated with this? Why am I even so fascinated with this? Because I thoroughly enjoyed watching it at the time. And part of the reason I haven't rewatched it is because I don't want to I don't want to find that I would still enjoy it the same way.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's enough about me. The episode I dig into, like, well, why are people connecting so much about this? And it's because the justice system has failed several times. I start citing Brock Turner, who basically sexually assaulted I think she was a passed out girl who witnesses saw it, and yet he was tried and sentenced for 6 months of jail time, and then only served 3 and was back out. It's an amazingly irritating and angering story to read, but I think it's deeply important.
Yeah.
And then there was, currently we're seeing a lot of police violence and stuff come more to the light. And so you're told you're supposed to be safe with the police, and then you're finding out that might not be true. And then I even cite, and this is probably my biggest section during the episode, was citing how there's just 70 years of recorded sexual assault cases within the church led by church figures and stuff.
Yeah.
And all of that gets you to a point where, like, the information age, making that so readily available to everybody, now you're just going, well, what the heck am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
Who am I supposed to believe and have trust in? And that goes in hand with the founding fathers, where a lot of people that really put their faith on depending on the American dream and the American system and the American experiment are either wrestling with the fact that the founders of America were just as sinful as anyone else, or even more so in some cases, or are just trying to ignore it. And I think that's where the debate of Hamilton comes in, is because they're like, is Hamilton as a play ignoring those things? Is Hamilton as a play not talking about them enough? Is Hamilton as a play just something else? Which I think I lean on that side. I think Lin-Manuel Miranda had a story he wanted to tell, and is also depending on the fact that other stories will cover other parts of the founding fathers.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to me, but I don't think it's a bad conversation to be having, because basically what's happening is people are being challenged with existentialism, which I kind of feel like is the first stage of becoming Christian, is learning that this age isn't right.
Yeah. All have sinned and fallen short. Yeah. Because it's much easier to worship a hero than it is to understand the complexity of good and evil.
Right. And so it's a perfect place for Christians to be able to go, you're right, the founding fathers were terrible and stuff like that. Well, let's talk about a real hero, Jesus Christ. Bam! You're now evangelizing, baby. It's perfect.
But you really could use it that way if you wanted to. And you see that a lot in pastor worship in churches, where a pastor will be, held up as perfect. And then somebody finds out that, they sinned, and then it destroys the faith of all those people in the church.
Yes.
I mean, it's not an excuse for us to continue sinning, but the reality is that all of us will sin. And if we hold people up, we're asking for a fall.
Right.
On my Patreon things for Truce, I've had some of my Patreon subscribers come back and say, Chris, you probably don't want to be telling people the negative things that you're wrestling with while making this show. But it's like,
they're going to hate my show because I say stuff I'm struggling with all the time.
Because I want, I want people to know that even though I'm trying to make an authoritative show, I myself am a human being.
Yes.
Just one underfunded human being who's also, got 3 other jobs. And that's really hard for us to hear in the Christian market. We want everybody to be gotten like demigods. That is not reality. And that is not what the Bible puts forward. Yeah. So anyway, we got through like 2 fun facts.
and that second one just led us into a not so fun conversation.
Oh my
but
goodness.
It was very good. I absolutely love that. I think those are the conversations we need to be having, and people need to be having about Hamilton. So that's
true.
Totally great.
It's true.
Now, on to a fact that should spark a good feeling, good vibes kind of thing. The third fact, or trivia, or whatever you want to call it, plenty of political figures and celebrities have seen Hamilton, as well as a fair amount that visited after the show to meet the cast. However, not everyone makes it back, and well, I'll quote Lin-Manuel Miranda directly from this Rolling Stone interview that I got some of these from. It speaks for itself. Quote, Mitt Romney was here a couple of weeks ago, but didn't come back. I really wanted to see that hair in person. I am in awe of his hair. I've had my agreements and disagreements with him politically, but goodness, it's just so, every time, maybe the best hair in politics, end quote. Isn't that amazing?
It's kind of fun, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, man. That's great too, because I think of all of the qualities Donald Trump has, of which we are not digging into, his hair is definitely the one that I remember the most. And so it's funny that he's saying Mitt Romney's got the better hair in the game.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I think Mike Pence actually went to a staged production of Hamilton, and they had at the end during the bow, they had a message for him.
They did. That's right.
Yeah, try to respect people. That made international news as well, and kind of upset a lot of people. But yeah, a lot of political figures have gone, including the Obamas, who Michelle Obama said it was her favorite work of art of any kind.
Aw, that's really sweet.
Paintings, drawings, theater, music is her favorite piece of art, which was pretty incredible because, as you probably know, one of its sort of principal founding stories was that Lin-Manuel Miranda had written just sort of a rough sketch of a song, of the first song of the musical, and performed it for the Obamas at a poetry jam. And you can actually see this on YouTube. It's pretty fascinating. So that then 7 years later, they bring back the cast of Hamilton when it's a full stage production and perform it at the White House.
Wow.
Because the Obamas were just super fans. I think that must have been a tremendous thrill amongst many. I mean, he won, I think it was 11 Tonys and then Pulitzer Prize for Hamilton. I can only imagine that having the President of the United States tell you, and his wife tell you it was one of their favorite works of art of all time. That's pretty incredible.
That is. And speaking of Tonys, the fourth fact is that despite roughly 9 or so minutes of onstage time, Jonathan Groff, who performs King George III, was able to net a second Tony nomination, spittle and all.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. This one here is one of the sweetest ones that I read, also with Jonathan Groff. Number 5 is, in between his segments on stage, Jonathan Groff, in an interview with, and by the way, Jonathan Groff, if you're listening to this podcast, and I'm totally mispronouncing your last name or first name or any part of your name, tweet at me and then come on the show. In between his segments on stage, Jonathan Groff, in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, is quoted saying, "I read all the books I have always wanted to read, but never did."
Right, because he spends most of the show off stage. So he was able to just read a ton. Yeah.
He then shares that not once, but twice he would finish reading a book, began weeping over its impact, and then realize he had to go on stage in like a minute. You can imagine how difficult that would be, considering how King George III is basically a comedic break in the dramatic play.
Yeah.
Would you like to hear these, Chris?
I would absolutely love to hear it. Yeah.
So the first was after finishing Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, an intimate nonfiction written from father to son about the United States history and current racial crisis. Quoting from the same interview, quote, "That one I was weeping in the dressing room. My mind was so blown, and then I had to go out and play this white king, and I thought, goodness, I am white supremacy right now, and it's seriously affected my performance," end quote. Goodness. I can't even...
Having done theater, I will say that there is a joy in having done a show so many times that you don't have to act much anymore. You just kind of fall into muscle memory. And I kind of hope that that's what happened to him, is that he just fell into the muscle memory.
But now I'm sure every listener is wondering what the second situation was for Jonathan Groff to be like weeping before going on stage. And this one's really sweet. The second case was finishing A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. If you didn't know, I had to repeat that like 6 times, but you're only going to hear it the one time. The story is basically about 4 college students who move to New York with lofty aspirations, and ultimately about the families we come from and the ones we make along the journey we call life. On A Little Life, Jonathan Groff is quoted saying, quote, "I was crying so hard, and I went down to Leslie Odom's dressing room because he was also reading the same book. I embraced him and cried into his neck, and then had to come back out and be King George," end quote. So he just had like a total bro moment and
yeah.
like had to go speak to his buddy about it, which Leslie Odom is Aaron Burr for anybody listening. And it's just like weeping into this guy's neck. And then it's like, all right, now I got to go out and be the white supremacy again.
He's got to pick happier books.
Yeah. Like, what's going on? Oh, man. Now these particular, they're facts 6 and 7, but they're kind of like the same. And I'm just gonna read all of this for you. Maybe you already knew all this, I don't know, but to anybody listening, you're definitely gonna want to hear it all together because there's a lot of weird numbers to it. So here we go. So Daveed Diggs, who performs Lafayette and Jefferson and Hamilton, had worked with Lin-Manuel Miranda prior to Hamilton on a hip-hop comedy improv group called Freestyle Love Supreme. He's also, I believe, the lead vocalist for Clipping, which is their album. There used to be I think it's called There Used to Be an Addiction to Blood. Very challenging album, but very good. But I mean, Daveed Diggs is just great with everything he does. So if you're liking Hamilton, you might enjoy that. Anyways, during the song Guns and Ships, aptly named, Reddit user Marquis de Lafayette breaks down the speed with which Daveed Diggs delivers his lyrics. So if you guys are ready to have your mind blown, this is crazy. So first off, the song has 319 words in total with a runtime of 2 minutes and 7 seconds. Breaking that down, that's about 2.5 words per second, which is pretty crazy. But of course, Daveed isn't singing the entire time of the song. The track has breaks for music and movement. So taking into account when he speaks, you're seeing a breakdown of about 4 to 6 words per second, with one line reaching 8 words per second, which is insane. And this is where the second fact kind of comes in, but it's all tied together. I ended up finding an article titled Hamilton would last 4 to 6 hours if it were sung at the pace of other Broadway shows, written by Leah Labresco on the website 538. We all know Hamilton, in embracing its hip-hop nature, is fast, but Leah Labresco is here to find out just how fast Hamilton really is. In the article, author Leah Labresco breaks down the cast albums of several plays, including Hamilton, figuring out their subsequent word counts and dividing it against the cast album's length. Hamilton takes the cake by a long shot, but I want to look at the runner-up first to really paint the picture here. The musical Spring's Awakenings cast album runs about an hour and a minute, with a total of 4,709 words. Breaking that up by words per minute, that's about 77 words per minute. Hamilton, however, is wild, with a cast album length of 2 hours and 23 minutes and a whopping 20,520 words. We're looking at an average of 144 words per minute.
Yeah.
That's insane. Spring Awakening doesn't even come close. Conversely, author Leah Labresco takes into account Pirates of Penzance, which has the lowest words per minute when comparing its cast album length, which is about an hour and 43 minutes, to its word count of 5,962 words. Rounding this, we get about 58 words per minute. So that's pretty slow. And if Hamilton were to take 58 words per minute to get through its wild 20,520 words, you would be sitting there in that theater for 5 hours and 55 minutes.
Wow.
And you thought Avengers Endgame was long.
Yeah.
That's insane. That's 2 Avengers Endgames. So that's insane.
I was surprised to see that Pirates of Penzance thing because they had that famous song, I Am the Picture of a Modern Major General, which is basically almost a rap because it's going so fast. And yet it was apparently very slow across the rest of the show.
Yeah, it's crazy. And just a cute thing to reinforce how crazy Guns and Ships is. When comparing simply the fastest verse, Guns and Ships beats out every other song included in the play she has chosen, with 18 words across 3 seconds. So that's about 6.3 words a second. The runner-up was a song titled Not Getting Married Today from the play Company, with 68 words over 11 seconds, coming out to 6.2 words per second, so it just missed the cut. But author Leah Labresco feels inclined to give the reward to Company for fastest, as whomever is singing would have to deliver their lyric consistently over a longer period of time, as Daveed Diggs has breaks between his time to breathe while the cast surrounding him cheers. Even though that's stupid impressive for a play that's already like massive.
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who has been trying to like sing along to Hamilton like has experienced this where they feel bad that they haven't gotten every word right.
Yeah.
And I have gotten there, and then I have to remember, you know what? It's got so many more words than any other musical. It's like you have to take it easy on yourself. Like, I was on a hike once with a friend and backpacking, and we were trying to sing along, and it was amazing that neither of us could remember whole sections of the show, even though we were listening to it over and over again and trying to sing along. There are so many words.
That was actually one of my biggest worries when starting it, was that it was so fast paced that I was like, I know this isn't like a big budget, crazy action movie with a bunch of stuff going on, but I'm getting that experience where I'm being so front loaded with information that I just can't keep up and enjoy it the way it's supposed to be enjoyed. However, by the time I got to the second half, I'll describe it this way. I was basically beaten into submission, accepted that this was the experience, and learned to enjoy it. And I enjoyed it. So that was a good thing.
I had the same experience when I saw Les Mis for the first time. Les Miserables. Another Broadway musical turned into a movie. That one, there is so much story involved. I was really concerned I wouldn't be able to follow along. But because they take such care of you as an audience member to walk you through, you can at least get the main points, even if you're not getting every subtlety. And I think Hamilton does the same, especially by focusing on just a few characters. I think that's another benefit of having cut Ben Franklin out of the musical, is that even though he was important in the founding of the country, he wasn't important to the story they were telling. And that's a really good bit of care that an author takes for the audience, is when they just give you a few people to hold on to.
So I thought one of the big things about historical fiction, historical narratives, is historical accuracy, and we've talked about this many times on the Cinematic Doctrine podcast before. Historical media, whether fiction or nonfiction, has a unique and difficult task, that there's a responsibility to recognizing that there's a depiction of historical figures and events, and how that depiction can be influential. Now, that impact can be good or bad. However, it's a strong reality that historical fiction and nonfiction has the opportunity to make an impact on the general public and how they perceive those events in real life. And Hamilton is no exception to that. In fact, it is very much the exception, because Hamilton is very much the prime example of how powerful historical fiction can be.
Yeah.
And we dig into that much further in our Samson episode of the podcast, where my wife and I spend an entire section going over this sort of thing. We don't really need to do that here, but I am interested in the true history behind Hamilton and the founding fathers. So Chris, would you happen to have any insight into those historical accuracies and inaccuracies in Hamilton?
Yeah, I got a nice list of historical inaccuracies. I tend to think, just as a side note for me, it helps to think of the show as a work of art and not necessarily as a historic document.
Yes.
That is not really what it's trying to do. And I think that sort of media literacy is something that we definitely lack in our modern age.
Yes.
We're not really good at separating fact from fiction, or fact from art.
Yeah, media literacy is like a subsection of like anti-intellectualism, where like it's this idea that like you need to know that while this is historical fiction, he had to read historical documents to get that. You can go read those historical documents.
You can.
But anyways.
Yeah. And one of the great benefits of this show is that it is bringing people to that point where they're researching it themselves. You know, a lot of people have read that Ron Chernow book that Hamilton is based on, about the history of Hamilton and what actually happened. And oftentimes, one of the purposes of art, and it can be very frustrating for some folks, is not necessarily to make a specific point, but to get you to think about something in a different way. Like there was a famous, I'm going to butcher the name of it, but there's a famous work of art that's in the New York City, and it's just a shark suspended in formaldehyde. And it's just a big old case, and you can walk all around it. And a lot of people were like, this is not art. It's just a shark suspended in formaldehyde. And then I looked at the nameplate when I was there, and it said something about like, I'm contemplating the reality of mortality or something like that. And I was like, oh, now if you think about knowing what the title of it is, that it's about mortality, you see this great beast that's in this tank of formaldehyde that once was ferocious and roaming the oceans, just gobbling up food. And now it's in a museum and it's completely harmless. And you start to see those bigger themes in there. So sometimes all it takes is just our art is just about starting a conversation about something. Like that shark was starting a conversation about mortality. Hamilton is starting discussions about race and the founding fathers and the country. Even inside theater, why aren't there more roles for theater is historically very liberal, leaning. With a very liberal leaning medium, there are not a lot of great roles for Hispanic people or for African Americans. It's still very much a white person's game. And so you got all these roles that were traditionally played by white men, Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton. If you see 1776, the musical, it's just a sea of white. But in Hamilton, they have kind of turned that on its head, where it's, they're creating a lot of roles for a lot of different people, which is pretty cool. So anyway, that's another soapbox I'm off of. Differences.
I loved it.
Yeah, differences between history and the musical. And again, understand it's a work of art. Like I said, Washington's slavery is not really addressed directly, and he is sort of a hero in the musical. Like, he's very authoritative. He takes charge of things, and he has some just beautiful songs. I mean, the actor who plays him has one of the best. His name's Chris Jackson, one of the best voices in the whole cast.
Oh yeah,
but he barely mentions that this guy who was fighting for the Union was also a slaveholder.
Yeah.
And another thing that I thought was really fascinating is that there's a big focus on Philip, which is Hamilton's son, who gets in a duel and dies in a duel. Hopefully that doesn't ruin anything for anybody. But Hamilton actually had 8 children, which is, you don't get, because of the limitations of telling a giant story, you can't go through every single kid. But that's, an interesting little nugget. They only really focus on one of his kids. And as I said, it's possible that Hamilton and his family did own slaves, which is interesting because in the musical, you hear a lot about him fighting against slavery or talking down on slavery.
Yeah.
We'll never be free until we end slavery, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
He may have been a part of it, which is convicting.
Yes.
And there's all these different things. A lot of the confusion about the show, a lot of the historic inaccuracies are just timing things. Like, this didn't happen until later, or,
right.
He reshuffled things. In the way that Lin-Manuel Miranda organizes the show, throughout the first act, Hamilton and Burr keep meeting over and over again and just running into each other in different ways. And in life, they really did intersect in different ways, but not always the ones that are depicted in the musical. And I imagine that was probably a frustration to try to explain, because Hamilton and Burr may have actually met at Elizabethtown Academy, which was sort of like a precursor to college. Sort of like it was something that Hamilton did in order to get ready to go to King's College. Was he went to Elizabethtown Academy. That may have been their first actual meeting, instead of the one that's depicted in the musical, which is after Hamilton may have punched the bursar at King's College. And apparently that didn't happen either, but it makes for a nice story. But it may not have happened. And their first actual documented meeting wasn't until 1786. But they probably met earlier because they were both lawyers at the same time. And so they probably interacted. And actually, Burr briefly served on Washington's staff, which is interesting because there's a song where, or a moment where Burr comes into Washington's office during the war and is like, I'd like to become a part of your staff. Well, actually, Burr was a part of Washington's staff, but he left so he could be the aide-de-camp of General Putnam instead. So he was actually kind of Hamilton's counterpart in the war, just with a different general. So
interesting.
Yeah. But again, it makes a much tidier story if it's,
yes.
If you just see Hamilton besting him, you start to get a little bit of that idea of his jealousy of Hamilton. And that really comes out in that song, Wait For It.
Oh, yes. that is like a seething song.
It is. And it's such a great, to me, okay, I know this is a bias, but I love, like, my favorite songs in musicals or any kind of show are generally the bad guy songs, because you get this passion in them that you don't always get with the protagonist. And Wait For It is such a great song because it's all about how much he wants to be like or wants what Hamilton has, and that he's a great man, but he just hasn't been given the opportunity. It's such a great song.
Yeah, I think it's the rawness and the honesty of it. There's really no buttering up. There's no hiding behind pride. It is technically pride, but it's like not hiding it.
Right.
And while it's important to keep your pride in check, you can't really respond to it if the light hasn't been brought to it. And so as an audience member, it becomes very powerful because he's like singing it to you, like to your face.
Yeah.
And now you're like, oh, I connect with that, but you don't want to tell anybody you connect with it, because it's, but then you do. And that's why it's so powerful.
It's so good.
That is a deeply powerful song. Deeply powerful.
I love it. I have belted that song many a time in my car.
That's great.
So there's a lot of the whole list of other historic inaccuracies. Martha Washington may not have actually named her cat after Hamilton because Hamilton was a bit of a player. And so there's a joke in the musical that Martha Washington named her tomcat after him because he was a player. May not have actually happened. Also a great little joke. That's pretty fun. And then also like the wedding of Eliza and Hamilton is a really big event in the show, but almost nobody actually came to support Hamilton. First of all, because he didn't really have much of a family. So it was very much the Schuyler sisters and their family. And he didn't really have anybody there, but also because he was, all of the people he knew in the U.S. were working on war preparations and they weren't about to leave war preparations for a funeral or for a wedding. It probably wasn't the big event that you see. And also the Schuyler sisters had 3 brothers who are not mentioned in the show.
That's right. And Peggy kind of just vanishes anyway. So
she does. And, and she does Hamilton does a really interesting thing with those kind of characters where in the first act, you'll have an actor playing one thing. And in the second act, you'll have another playing same actress playing a different thing. So she actually ends up becoming Mariah Reynolds, who is sort of the temptress in the second act that he ends up falling for.
I didn't even notice that. So I guess that makes sense why she's gone in the second half. Yeah.
Well, and her singing style, like the actress who played her was so good. Her singing style is dramatically different between the 2 roles. So it would actually be hard to tell if you didn't know, but she does a stunning job. And actually there was a comedian who brought up while we were talking about sort of things that are controversial about the musical, that song where Hamilton seduces Mariah Reynolds or the other way around, or both are seducing each other. The song is called Say No to This. And the lyrics are, Lord, show me how to say no to this. And Hamilton says that as he's being tempted to sleep with this woman. There's a comedian who pointed out, and I wish I'd remembered her name, but she said, say no to what? She didn't ask you anything.
Yeah, that's true.
Mariah Reynolds comes to him looking for help because her husband has been abusive and she needs money. And Hamilton ends up sleeping with her and carrying on a relationship with her. So there's this other sort of thing that doesn't really get addressed in the musical was Mariah Reynolds participating in this on her own volition?
Oh, wow.
Or was she forced by a powerful man into a relationship for money? So.
Interesting. Yeah, because there's that lyric later on. It's when he writes the letters to acquit himself of treason that he mentions that it's quote unquote consensual. But then, if the husband exploits the particular relationship that Hamilton and his wife are in, and she was sharing that like it was abusive, then it probably was coercion, or because she then pleads afterward that like I didn't have anything to do with it or anything. So it's like but it is like a difficult thing too, because then is she lying or not? But the reality still is like the 2 things that are going on are sin makes everything worse.
Of course.
So like basically like there's several different sins in that particular thing taking place. And then, yeah, I think the comedian's spot on too. It's like, say no to what? She's not asking you.
Right.
Like, she's asking for help. and
Yeah.
the song implies that she's seducing him, but yeah, it's another very difficult thing. But I think honestly, like those sort of discussions will always happen
Yeah.
when popular media happens, like, because there's just different experiences with popular challenging media. And I would say Hamilton's relatively challenging. The second act is definitely challenging.
Yeah. It's very rich. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. Yeah. A lot of stuff, especially as our lenses keep changing. One of the things is you watch videos online, sort of before our current moment with Black Lives Matters protests going on here this summer 2020. Different themes were standing out to people before when the show originally came out. And now the themes of racism and slavery are really standing out to people.
Yes.
So it's kind of the interesting thing about art is that the time in which you view it can change your impression of that piece, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So onward with the fast facts. We've got Aaron Burr. There are 3 duels in the musical, and Aaron Burr was not Charles Lee's second during the duel. So he wasn't even there. He was hundreds of miles away, but it makes for a much, again, nicer story point if Burr is at the first duel and then is, participating in the third duel when he actually kills Hamilton. It makes a nice symmetry in the show, but it didn't happen in real life.
Yes.
Yeah. And Washington, there's a really kind of a powerful scene. Hamilton has been asking for command in the Revolutionary War, and Washington won't give it to him because he's way more valuable as his secretary, and writing letters and all that kind of stuff. And in the musical, Washington sends Hamilton home angry after the duel with Charles Lee and with John Lawrence and Charles Lee. In reality, Hamilton quit because he wasn't given command. He wasn't sent home for being like a disrespectful son figure, like he is in the musical, which does change things. But I think what's really great about that sort of anger at being called son and being disrespected, is it feels like that is respect is such a big part of hip hop. Earning respect and getting respect from people is such a big part of that culture that story point really just fits better with Hamilton feeling disrespected.
Yes.
Within the Hamilton, or within the framework of hip hop. So I think it works.
Yeah. And even thinking about his pride too, like being called son would feel demeaning.
Of course.
So that makes complete sense.
Yeah. There's kind of this thing in the musical where Hamilton looks like he's a more successful lawyer than Burr, because after the war, they both became lawyers and settled into their careers. But actually, Burr made a lot more money than Hamilton did because Hamilton charged less. He was more advocating for people and for justice. But Burr was actually a more successful lawyer. It's kind of a interesting little tidbit.
Yeah.
Huh. And there's Hamilton wrote a great portion of the Federalist Papers. 51 of the Federalist Papers. There's a scene where Hamilton approaches Burr to ask him to help write this, to defend the Constitution, to stand up for a strong central government, like federal government. And there's no evidence that Hamilton actually approached Burr to write any of the Federalist Papers. So, and I mean, then I guess maybe I'll wrap it up with this one. Jefferson wasn't actually gone for all the war. He starts out Act 2 with this great song, "What Did I Miss?"
It is so
It
good.
is really fun.
wearing an outfit that looks like Prince. It's great.
Exactly. Yeah. Talking about all the things he did in France and how important he is and stuff and how brilliant he is. It's a really fun song. But Jefferson actually didn't leave until 1784. So he was actually there for a good portion of the war. Again, they've got so much ground to cover. It kind of helps them to push characters into I don't want to say a one-dimensional place, but to cut out some of the dimension of them to make us understand who they were.
Yeah.
Jefferson did, having him look like he was gone the whole time kind of fits the narrative better than being like, oh, well, he wasn't that important during the war.
It also makes for a very good meta joke
Yeah.
because David Diggs has been there the whole time.
Oh, yes. I guess I hadn't thought about
And
that.
so him coming in being like, what did I miss? It's like, you are very clearly the same actor. That's like, it says there's just something really,
Right.
that to me, starting the second act like that to me was hilarious.
Yeah.
Purely because, I mean, we've seen the guy for the last hour and a half.
Yeah.
It's just
Well,
like,
then you've got
it's so
Jefferson,
good.
who was supposedly in France during the whole war. And then you've got Lafayette, who is French, who's in the United States fighting.
Right. Yes. It was so good. Because there was a lyric that he says something. He directly says that he was in France or whatever.
I'm in France meeting lots of different ladies.
Yeah. And then, him mentioning
Yeah.
that too is like, this is so clever. It is such fascinating writing.
Yeah.
Really, really good stuff.
It's a lot of fun. I mean, and there are some really great historic moments that do happen in the show. One of the reasons that also fascinates me is that, like with my show, I've spent a fair bit of time talking about the founding fathers and who were they, because we often hold on to like the United States is a Christian nation, that idea. And one of the ways that we try to support that is that the founding fathers were Christians. And that's the argument anyway. But in reality, most of them were somewhere between Christianity and deism. Deism is the idea that God set the world in motion and walked away. Whereas Christianity is obviously that God is very much involved to the point where he sent his own son to die for our sins. The core 8 founding fathers, Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, Gouverneur Morrison, James Wilson, all of them, while they were writing the foundational documents, actually starting the country, were neither Christian nor deist. They were in between. They didn't believe that Jesus was God. They would often believe that Christianity was a good moral code, but it was not necessarily the way to God. Like John Adams didn't believe that Jesus was the only way to the Lord.
So was it John Adams or one of the other guys that did the Bible where he made his own edits and then did he like either successfully or attempted to distribute it? Which one was that?
Yeah, it's Thomas Jefferson. And you can still pick up copies. I think they now call it the Jefferson Bible. And you can pick up a copy of it. And what he did was he was not a big fan of the Old Testament, first of all, but he would just cut out stuff he didn't like the miracles of Jesus. He didn't like those. What he really enjoyed was the morality of Jesus, which, I mean, if you're founding a country, it can be very useful because you do need your citizens to act in a moral way to each other.
Right.
That is just a foundational part of building a country.
But who wouldn't like the first miracle of turning water into wine?
I know, especially
everybody
those guys.
Likes that one,
especially those guys.
That's a great one.
Well, what's cool about the musical Hamilton is that further down the road, after Hamilton's son has been killed in the duel, there's a great song called "It's Quiet Uptown." It's rather moving. It's about Hamilton and Eliza dealing with the loss of their son. And Hamilton says, and I prayed, and that never used to happen before. And they talk about going to church on Sundays. And in real life, Hamilton, after that fact, became a believer. And he is the only one of the original founding fathers who actually, of that core 8, who actually believed in Jesus. So it's kind of a beautiful thing for me as a Christian to see that moment. It's very subtle in the musical. It's an interesting thing to me because we tend to hold up the United States as a Christian nation. As Christians, we really want to believe it is, and that the founding fathers were. And a lot of that comes from them using in their public speeches references to the Bible. Like even Washington in the musical quotes the Bible. Like the scripture says, everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. And I think it's in One Last Time, the song. He does that. And that's referencing Micah 4 and 1 Kings 4:25 and Zechariah 3:10. Mm-hmm. But what a lot of these guys were doing was that they had a relationship with the Bible in that they liked to quote it, but they weren't living it, and they weren't believing it.
Which sounds a lot like Pharisees.
Yeah.
It's like exploiting scripture for
Well,
For what?
in
For good works,
yeah, in
really.
some ways, it's to build a better society. In other ways, it's to sound literate, like literary.
Kind of like, I don't know if you knew this about Walt Disney, but the reason a lot of his writing and stuff was so old timey, of which people didn't really talk like that much, but he kind of did it just to sound literate.
That's funny.
It's a really good contrast to sort of the workplace culture, which was very frat boy in early Disney.
Right.
That he would be sending out letters to his employees that sounded like something like only like an old money guy would write. So it's just like it's just really bizarre. But continue, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say the other example that I think of a lot is Stephen King. You know, he's a horror writer, and he references scripture in his books a lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
And Pet Sematary reads like a story of somebody who is wrestling with sin and just never got past the whole Jesus part.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And you see it constantly in his books, but he is not a believer. And I don't think you would ever call his books Christian, but because it's in there, it gives it a sort of depth because he's referencing something that we can kind of hold in common as a society. And so I think that's what a lot of those founding fathers were doing, as they could see the depth that was there, but they didn't necessarily believe it themselves. And they knew it would be good for the country to reference those things, but they didn't believe themselves. And Churchill was the same way. He didn't believe that in Jesus, but he would reference scripture as well.
So I definitely wanted to get into one particular topic that's huge for this.
Sure.
And I know that anybody listening, you're probably like, what more can they talk about with this? But also they're probably like, keep talking about Hamilton. We love it. That's the big thing right now. So hopefully you're on the second half. And we've kind of touched on this topic before already, just kind of lightly, briefly, but I really want to dig into it here. So Lin-Manuel Miranda kind of seems to come from a position of hope with his work on Hamilton. In fact, the entire atmosphere around Hamilton, its cultural impact, how people have fallen in love with its music, its portrayal of history, so much of what makes Hamilton powerful for a lot of people is its hopeful portrayal and modern depiction of American history and the American idea, the experiment. For instance, Hamilton isn't just a historical narrative, it's a depiction of how certain people see history. In other words, it represents our day and age more so than the setting within the play. We just went over the historical accuracies and stuff like that, and it really does come down to how people, the narrative being said and stuff like that. So Hamilton, as it was created and exists today, feels like the passing of a baton. It looks like the ideals of the founding fathers and turns its gaze to our generation and says, you're next, grab the baton and start running. And something about that fascinates me because the last few years have shown another baton. We've seen the baton of evil that was rooted deeply in the founding fathers and the development of the United States. Because we're living in an age where things also have sin in them, and that includes countries. We see opportunism plaguing the private sector as capitalism shows its true colors. We see systematic oppressions that show that a country doesn't actually represent all of its people. Or as you expertly cover, Chris, in your podcast episode, Is the U.S. a Christian Nation? Which you actually started to reference, I think, earlier, but
Yeah.
which is fantastic, by the way. The United States
Thank
only
you.
passively embracing the religious ideal for the sake of moralism. In other words, a common ground of moral understanding, not a devotion to any one particular belief system. And Hamilton seems to reignite a hope in the good baton. It directs the United States to look at what it wants to be while somewhat deconstructing what it is currently. To that end, I think that's pretty dang neat. The more I learn about my generation, the overwhelming reality of modern living in the United States, that Zoomers and millennials are basically being given on a silver platter something that's deteriorating faster than I can say, okay, boomer, is really depressing. But looking back to the aspirations of the founding fathers is encouraging, somewhat. But also I find it really sad because I've also seen online a fair amount of well-written and very important dissent against Hamilton about its ironically categorized, whitewashed historical image, in its hope of directing a new generation to carry the good baton of the founding fathers into the new age, constantly developing and reforming the experiment we know as the US of A. We also kind of can't ignore that bad baton that I mentioned earlier. For instance, and people can read about this independently, but some criticism includes equating the historical romanticism of the founding fathers seen in Hamilton akin to films like The Patriot or American Sniper, which I think is a little bit of a stretch, but I can understand it. But basically they're saying that it comes from an overtly nationalistic position almost to a fault. The irony presented in most criticism of this kind of makes reference to the intentional casting, that what we're seeing isn't a multicultural cast overcoming the failures of the bad baton, but co-opting it and giving it a new window dressing. To that end, more succinctly, it proposes that Hamilton is an ironic if you can't beat him, join him mentality. There's a lot to pick apart here, Chris, and I
Yes,
know
there
you're
is.
a big fan of this play, and some of what I'm proposing is a bit of devil's advocate here.
It's fine.
So hopefully I'm not overwhelming you, but
No.
what are your thoughts on Hamilton as this cultural phenomena that both reignites a passion for the hopeful ideals of the United States, as well as the criticism against it with regards to its overt nationalism and occasional whitewashing rhetoric? What do you think about all that?
I think in a lot of ways, we can't ask any work of art to be perfect. I think that is sort of a dangerous precedent for us to have, because like one of the things for me doing Truce, I have been really afraid of doing a show about Black Lives Matter because I'm white, and I don't have the words, I don't have the grounding for it, and I'm afraid of getting picked apart. And honestly, I think that is something I should get over. We're in an era now where we expect people to be so super righteous, perfect in every way, and also understand what people are going to think of us 200-300 years in the future when mores have changed, which is very difficult. We have no control who lives, who dies, who tells our story, which is the reality of things. We don't know how we're going to be seen in the future. I mean, it could be 40, 50 years from now, our kids are like, you liked Hamilton? It's such a racist show. But they won't know that in our time, Broadway is still very white, and that this show breaks a lot of ground. I mean, you look at something like Showboat, which was, I wish I looked up the dates. I want to say it came out in the 20s or 30s. It's been out for a long time. It was one of the first major American musicals that featured Black characters of any kind, doing much of anything at all. And you look at it now and they seem sort of stereotypical, sort of like Gone with the Wind, depictions of African Americans. But in its time, Showboat was a phenomenon. And it was very culturally significant how it did it. Unfortunately, I think part of our problem is that we have a hard time understanding art in its time. And that's not to say we shouldn't strive to make things great, but you have to accept things for how they are. There is no one piece of work of art. There is no one speaker who is going to be perfect all the time. And I think we get into trouble with this in the church. We have so many our lists of theological requirements to go to a certain church are so long that the church has to be, the preacher has to be premillennialist, Calvinist, pro-Baptist, anti-infant baptism, but pro-infant dedication. There have to be, so many songs, but there can't be any Hillsong songs, or, we have to sing the doxology at the end of every Sunday.
I've heard even can't have drums.
Right.
That's kind of an older one, but that was one.
And I mean, I understand we all have our little things, and some of them are actually very important. But we go into every church assuming that if every church doesn't have things exactly like our last church did, then it is not doing the work of God. And I think we struggle with those things that are negotiable. The Bible doesn't have really anything to say about whether or not you read out of a hymnal or if you read off of a screen. It really doesn't have anything to say about that. But we make a big stink out of those things. We want things to be absolutely perfect. And if they're not perfect, they're absolutely bad. And I don't think that is particularly healthy. One of the things that gives me hope about Hamilton is that it does demonstrate to us out of what kind of struggle rose our Constitution. And what you see, if you read the Constitution and you study, you see a document that is constantly being updated in order to make up for previous injustices. So giving women the right to vote, for example, wasn't in there until, what was it, 1918, 1920, somewhere in there. I really should know that. But it took a long time for women to get the right to vote. But the beauty of the thing is it didn't take a revolution to do it. We didn't have to overthrow the whole country to do that, to right the injustices. the beauty of the Constitution is that, yes, it was made by flawed people who were taking a lot of pulling from a lot of different sources, but they ultimately came up with something that is flexible. So when people are talking about revolution right now, and I have to say, after studying revolutions, I've studied the French and now the Russian and now the American revolutions. You don't want an actual revolution.
No, you don't.
We use that word very loosely. You don't want a war fought over something that we can just adapt to in our founding document. That's the beauty of the American system. As you know, as a guy who's spending a year talking about the American system, and maybe people think I'm anti-America, it is not true at all. The beauty of our system is that it can be changed and updated, and there is a great deal of hope in that. And so that's where I take my hope from. That with all that's going on in 2020 and all the struggles that people are feeling, I feel like our system can take it. And that we don't need a full-on, guns and tanks revolution. What we need is just a change of heart and an updating and improving of our legal system as we learn how to do that. So I don't know. Things like Hamilton give me a lot of hope because you see how they can bring up conversations. They can make us talk about some really interesting and fascinating things that we would
Absolutely.
not. I mean, who would have been talking about the founding fathers if it hadn't been for Hamilton right now? I mean, it's bringing up some really, really good stuff. And it's lending a lot of depth to those conversations in the Black Lives Matter movement that I think is just crucial. So I'm super glad to have it in my life. And I'm glad that it came out on Disney Plus and people can access it for, what is it, $7 a month? It's a really good time
for dirt
that.
cheap.
Yeah.
For less than a tenth of the price.
Yeah. I mean, when I saw it in Salt Lake City, I think I paid $120 for my ticket.
It's a lot.
But $7? Yeah, I'll do that.
That is deeply hopeful and deeply encouraging, because I definitely fall into the cynic camp when it comes to the current age we live in.
Yeah.
That's not to say that I don't think the Lord can fix things, but oftentimes it's easy to think that the Lord will fix things with wrath.
Right. And sometimes he does.
And that's very convicting, because the Lord is far more clever than I am, and he can fix things however he wants. And so that is hopeful and encouraging.
Well, I think if you need something that gives you hope in a time of revolution, learn more about the women's rights movement, the suffrage movement. And I actually did 2 episodes on Truce in season 2 about it. But you study about people like Carrie Nation and their roles in fighting, because they did go to some really great lengths to try to get what they deserved, what's the right to vote. But they didn't burn the country down in the process. They were just faithful, and they fought, and they fought well, but they didn't have to resort to becoming what they disliked.
Amen to that.
Yeah. So it's a great study. If you can, especially the women's Christian temperance movement is an interesting study, and how they achieved what they wanted to get.
Well, this has been an absolutely amazing episode. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I just really want you to know that. Yeah. I thought this was a lot of fun, and I had the fear at first of like, I know nothing about Hamilton, this isn't going to go well, and that's okay. But then, like, after reading and putting out notes, you get that immediate confidence boost where you're like, well, if I fail somewhere, I know Chris will handle it. So then we hear you recording it, and the Lord's like, you know what, both of you are going to be on point. So
it's been a lot of fun.
God. That's really sweet. Yeah. I've had a blast here, Chris. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
So why don't you tell everybody where you're at again, and how they can get connected, check out anything you've worked on, stuff like that.
Yeah. So again, there's a lot of stuff going on. The novel is Cradle Robber. You can find it anywhere you get ebooks. It's not on paper yet. If somebody owns a major publishing house and wants to contact me, please do. You can find Bringing Up Bobby, which is our comedy film I mentioned with the Goth Kids. It's on PureFlix and on Amazon Prime. So if you've got an Amazon Prime subscription, you can get it for the cost of your subscription. And you can find Truce just about anywhere you get podcasts. I tend to recommend start with season 3, because I've gotten so much better as time has gone on. I really love season 2. I had a lot of good stuff to say in season 1, but it wasn't my best. So start with season 3, and I would love to hear from you. And so if you want to contact me, you can find me on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Truce Podcast.
Thanks so much for listening to our episode on Hamilton, and thanks so much Chris Staron for joining us here on the Cinematic Doctrine podcast. Be sure to check out his podcast Truce, the award-winning Christian podcast that looks at history to deep dive into the Christian church. Using interviews with experts, music, games, and recipes, Truce uncovers the things that glom onto the Christian church so that we can protect our witness to the world. It's all about how we got here and how we can do better. Now, if you've seen Hamilton, what did you think of it? Did this pop culture phenomena blow you away, or are you tired of these songs and ready to move on? If you're listening on Cinematic Doctrine's website, let us know in the comments below or shoot us an email to cinematicdoctrine@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this episode, consider leaving a review for the podcast on your respective podcast app at the end of this episode. Unlike YouTube or Reddit, there isn't really a way to let us know how we're doing with a thumbs up or thumbs down. So the best way is to leave your thoughts on the podcast by writing a review on iTunes, Podchaser, or wherever you listen. And as mentioned before, Cinematic Doctrine has a Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you're opted into a once-a-month movie poll where you decide a movie we discuss on the podcast. You also gain access to the Syndoc Pre-Show, a Patreon-exclusive podcast series where my co-host Daniel and I casually talk movies, Christianity, and life itself. There are other unique benefits that come with supporting the podcast, so be sure to check them out at patreon.com/Cinematic Doctrine. A special shout out to those who support at the Art House Theater tier on Patreon. Thank you so much, Mom, Dad, and Melanie. You guys are the best, and your continued monetary support is greatly appreciated. All of this will be available in the show notes. Until next time, stay cool. Want some Cinematic Doctrine swag? You're in luck! We've got 3-inch Cinematic Doctrine logo stickers exclusive for Patreon supporters. Perfect for your travel mug or laptop. Head over to patreon.com/Cinematic Doctrine, link in the show notes, and choose the Independent Theater tier. Doing so will net you other perks too. But let's be real, the podcast stickers are the coolest perk. So get yourself some podcast stickers by supporting on Patreon.